and they not only impacting in terms of the damages they incur, but they also cause a loss of life and livestock and livelihoods, and a lot of disastrous phenomena result in loss of basically development over the years. The very recent, is the Morocco earthquake, which killed approximately 3,000 people. This is official data, so it might be more. And the one which was very alarming was the Libya floods, where around 10,000 people had died, where due to the storms, the two of the cities collapsed. Two of the dams collapsed, and it caused two major cities completely into water, and people have died in huge numbers. So these statistics, are make us think as to why and what is actually raising the disasters or increasing the disasters to such an extent. And I think by this time of the STP, we all are aware, because you have been briefed about the basics of disaster, you have been briefed about the various aspects of disaster. So this is particular a repetitive slide to you, where we have the human acts, climate change, environmental pollution, and the poor urban governance as the key factors which are increasing disasters over the years. So this is again the same thing which has been elaborated here. Each of this, like for example, human acts, uncontrolled growth, which is if we go and land into the areas which are more hazardous, then it is but obvious that there will be more disasters or more impact of disaster. Climate change, we all know, because of climate change, there are extreme disaster events. Not only this, the environmental pollution caused by the humans and caused by the industries is leading to more and more changes in the geological phenomena, and causing more and more disasters. Whereas urban governance, now see, with these type of governance which is there in our city, where people are already stressed out, may it be traffic, may it be services, urban services, or may it be day to day life. If anything, even a small spell of rainfall happens here, it will be way more impactful than it is, in any other less chaotic space. So this is again very important. Now, why urban areas suffer more is, again, I think you have gone this, because urban areas are vulnerable in a lot of ways, where rapid urbanization, then geographical location, poor level of political and social organization, in an increasing number of natural events due to climate change, and absence of early warning system, as well as the last but not the least is not no awareness of the disaster threats. That is, the awareness is very bad. So the same thing has been highlighted here, which shows that how the rapid urban growth has resulted in the chaotic development or unplanned development. How the geographical locations, like most of the cities, are located in zone 5 earthquake zones. They are by themselves poor in, when we consider the geographical location. The housing stock is poor level of political and social organization. This is very common in most of the city, and bigger the city, this is a more severe problem. And there is a lot of climate change, we all know. Even if the rains are happening for an hour, it is very extreme. So climate change is resulting into all of that, and people are less aware about these kind of things which are happening. So there is basically another very important aspect, which is called risk accumulation, which is also seen in urban areas, and which is not seen in the much seen in the rural areas, where the risk accumulation is compounded, or risk is compounded and results into risk accumulation. Like, for instance, the poor waste management itself is a sort of risk to that particular group of community or people who are living there. Or it is the poor livestock, their structures are constructed so badly. We have seen the case of Kedarnath, where the structures were constructed so badly that it itself became a disaster, and the infrastructure. So this is basically risk accumulation, which is leading to a lot of increase in disasters. Then the next most important thing is we have to understand the risk, the relationship between disaster risk and urban risk. Now, We cannot do disaster risk management in isolation to urban risk management or urban development. So they have to go in hand, where there is nothing. If we look into today's context, nothing is a natural disaster. All the natural disaster are at some point triggered, or the disasters are happening because of the vulnerability of the people, or their exposure, or the extreme aspect or extreme event which happens. So urban risk management has to be integrated with disaster risk management. Now it is a process which is four stage process, where we identify the risk, whether it is a disaster risk or urban risk. We assess the risk. That is, we do an analysis to identify what are the triggering factors or how can we phase it out. Then, after phasing out, we communicate the risk. That is, we inform people through warning systems or through various strategies. And then the risk is addressed through the policies and implementation of these strategies. So, this is basically a cyclic process which over the time reduces the disaster risk. So, what kind of risks urban areas face because of disaster? Again, I'm sure you must have been told about these by now. It is the capital risk, which is nothing but the damage to government buildings, or the capital of that particular city. Then the environmental risk, a lot of environmental pollution, that is in terms of air pollution, water pollution, or loss of biodiversity, or change in microclimate. Then social and cultural risk is of course there, where people loss of life is there, where you have loss of culture or historical resources. The most important one among them is the economic risk, where everything which is lost is ultimately lost in terms of economy. It goes, the development goes year back into many years back, and there's a lot of financial implications of any disaster and institutional or policy risks. So based on these risks, the disaster management or the entire disaster management has to be integrated into the risk, into the urban development. Then we have the risk assessment. Actually, we should know what is a risk assessment. So again, this is very basic. This is talking about what is hazard. By this time, we all know what is hazard, what is exposure, the situation of people or infrastructure or housing production capacities, and and other tangible human assets located in hazard prone areas. It is very okay. Cities are exposed, and then comes their vulnerability. Vulnerability is the inability to resist a hazard or to respond. That means the capacity, the coping capacity is very weak, and that is why people become more and more vulnerable. This coping capacity can be less due to several reasons. Maybe due to the poor economic conditions, or maybe due to the poor living conditions or living surroundings. So this is how the risk is calculated, where risk is a function of hazard and vulnerability, where these two combine, the circle there becomes the risk to the particular community. And when this risk is not addressed properly, it becomes a disaster in the advent of any hazard which is happening. So to understand the disaster management, we have the disaster management cycle, which again has four phases. One is the preparedness phase. Preparedness phase, through the event which happens there, we have emergency response, then we have recovery, we have reconstruction, and the preparedness again goes back to the preparedness. And each of the time, it is a cyclic process. So more prepared we are due to a disaster, or maybe after a disaster, will lead to better response or resilience to a disaster. So now this is a diagram which shows that we need a shift of change, where disaster management and the urban risk management can be combined together to build a more resilient and safe city. So this has been discussed. So these are some uh, efforts which have been made internationally. By this time, we know that there is Millennium Development Goal, which again, which focus. one of the aspects is focuses on disaster management. We have cost cutting, capacity development. This was much more popular in the early 2010 to the 2015. It was much more popular. The Hyogo framework, which came after the Kobe earthquake in 2005, and Sendai framework, which was a follow up of 2000 Hyogo framework. So these were the major significant steps taken, or the charters which were laid out after the disasters were really the significance of disasters was understood. Then the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Risk Reduction (UNISDR) has been doing a lot of efforts to reduce disaster. We have 17 SDG goals, out of which the goals are now and then. Highlighting the significance of resilience, disaster management, and it is very much now people are very much more vigilant about the SDG goals, and a lot of work is being done in this respect, and so are the other efforts or other initiatives which have been taken, out of which making resilient cities. They had some 200 cities initially, and now they have increased to a lot more cities where cities can register there and take up into the activities. And we have the IFRC who are doing a lot of social service to mitigate the disasters, or in the time of emergency management. So coming down to all of these, with these advent, still there is an increase in disaster, and more the number of disasters as well as the togetherness of the disaster is seen. Like for example, we had COVID. Along with COVID, we had earthquake, we had floods, we had lot of other disasters which happened, and it was very difficult. We all have seen at that time as to manage the COVID and the disaster. So, what is a multi hazard, or what are multi hazards? Multi hazard means the selection of multiple major hazards that the country faces and the specific context where hazardous events may occur simultaneously, or they may occur because of one may occur because of the other, or cumulatively over the time. That means two or three disasters are occurring over the time, but they are not occurring at the same time, and taking into account the potential interrelated effects. Now, what is happening? The best example, if we can imagine right now, as I said, was the COVID duration, where along with COVID, we had floods, or along with COVID, we had earthquakes. So they were happening simultaneously. People cannot move out of the house, whereas they cannot stay inside the house. So that was the situation when these two disasters or more disasters were happening. So each had a specific characteristic. So this is a phenomena which is seen more and more in the present context. And disasters can be primarily multi-disasters can be understood as independent multi-disasters, which could be happening simultaneously or cumulatively or cascading, or independent disasters. So multi-hazard risk assessment is an approach that considers more than one hazard in a given place, ideally progressing to consider all known hazards and the interrelations between these hazards, including their simultaneous or cumulative occurrences. Now, what or how does multi hazard happen, or how do we understand the multi hazard? So, this is an image which was taken from one of the articles which was published on multi hazard risk assessment, which says that we have number of disasters. Primarily, if we see volcanic eruptions, they also cause tsunamis, or they also cause superficial landslide, earthquakes, which can result due to ground shaking or liquefaction, can cause rock falls or debris, or along with them we can have other disasters like slow moving landslide, because this is earthquakes are primarily about the unstable or unstable slope or the surface, and earthquakes and landslides are both caused because of the unstable slopes or surfaces. Then we have meteorological disasters, which again can cause rockfall, which could be caused by earthquakes. Which so it is a complex phenomena where we see the different categories of disasters can affect each other by either triggering, or by happening simultaneously or maybe over the time. Like for example, there's a lot of rainfall and there will be landslide, but it might not be immediately at the time of landslide. Sometimes it is also. Or if there is a ground shaking or there is an earthquake, then there might be a surface displacement over a period of time, maybe over an year or maybe over few months. So it is a very complex phenomena which can happen by between the disasters. So, if we understand what are independent multi hazards, this is an example of St. Vincent City where there were landslide, where there was debris flow, where there was a windstorm, all were happening at different times, but at a very shorter spans. And the city, it is not that the disasters are happening at different times, so the damage will be less. The problem is the city undergoes stress over and over and over within shorter periods instead of one single disaster. Many disasters are affecting people or infrastructure and everything. Then we have the cascading disaster. The best example which we can remember is the Uttarakhand Kedarnath disaster, where a lot of things happened. First, there were rainfall, then the rainfall was so high that it resulted in cloud burst. And I have a small video. If we can go through this video, it will be more understandable. Is it simultaneously? And this is an example where multi disaster happened all together, and it was also due to the cascading effect of rainfalls over the water reservoir. Then it led to, due to continuous rainfall for 3 days, the slopes became unstable. There was a landslide, there was a rock fall, and rock fall with the rock flow with the help of water. It speeded up the flow of the rock fall, and the disaster which could have been much more lesser in intensity got much more aggravated in intensity, and it resulted in a greater damage. And obviously the all the infrastructure and the housing which were there were anyway again not resilient. So everything coupled up in this particular disaster, multi disaster, and resulted in a huge loss, and a lots and lots of people died. So we understand the types of multiple disasters, and triggering factors are the disasters which are either natural disasters or man-made disasters can all be triggered by these triggering factors, which we have seen earlier also in the previous slide, like how the earthquakes can trigger the fire, or mass movement or meteorological aspects can trigger the other types of disasters. So this is basically again just to give an overview with respect to the understanding of multi disasters. So now the question comes, where exactly the multi disasters are more seen? I mean, who are affected more due to multi disasters? If you go to the rural side, or you go to the semi urban areas, it is not a common phenomena. Multi hazard is risk or is seen more in the dense cities, or more in the cities which are which are way more developed. Like, so this is a phenomena which is more popular in the urban areas or city areas. And why is it more popular is one thing, one question. What is the impact of these multi disasters? As we have understood, like any other disaster, each disaster is affecting the infrastructure or housing or people. Like we have seen the 5 types of risk which are generated because of the disasters and how they impact. Now these disasters can have direct, indirect, or secondary impacts, and the intensity or the damage is way more than the because of the cities being more dense and more complicated in their infrastructure and every other thing. So the impact of disasters is way more higher in cities, and it is also a phenomena which is more seen in cities. So there is a, like this is an example of cascading disasters. So by this time we have seen this is one single disaster which can cause cascading effects and result into these kind of disasters. This image was taken up from one of the research, where that research was addressing the typhoon disaster which they were, and when they were studying that, they understood that typhoon can cause rainstorm, winds, or storm surges, which can again cause seawater intrusion, flooding. And there is a series of disasters which are either cascading or which are interrelated because of that phenomena. So this was an example from one of the research papers. Again, the vulnerability is more uh, seen when vulnerability happens in loop. So this is a diagram which says the lower the exposure, or higher the exposure, more is the vulnerability loop. So again, coming down to the global hazard mortality risk distribution, when it comes to all hazard mortality, that is multi hazards all taken together. So multi hazard risks were calculated in this map, and were calculated by summing the vulnerability weighted single hazard mortality risk. That means these indices have been overlaid for each of the risks or hazards, and then the map has been derived, and this map shows the areas which are in red, shows the highest disasters, multi disasters, death mortality. So again, we have the understanding of multi hazard risk at global scale. Then we need to understand the multi hazard risk management and urban risk management synergies. Like, if I cut it short into two components, that is the urban risk management, urban risk assessment, and multi hazard risk assessment. Both of them are addressing the hazards, and there is a relationship between both the hazard assessments. If we integrate the disaster risk management in terms of multi hazard or single hazard at the time of hazard assessment, which is happening in both the cases, then there is a possibility that we can reduce it down to some extent. We cannot avoid it, the disasters cannot be avoided completely, but then we can increase the resilience and we can increase the coping capacity. So this is a map showing multi hazard zones in India, which is showing that, which is taking into consideration these combinations of disasters. This map is available in the Vulnerability Atlas, which is available on NIDM website. So we can see, depending upon whichever region we are staying, that what is the strength of, or what all multiple disasters are happening in each region. Or like, for example, this red zone. Now, this red zone is talking about I think this one, earthquake. This is earthquake. Then we have the wind cyclone damage risk zone. We have the wind and cyclone very high damage zone. Similarly, we have a lot of, I think, earthquake. They all are combined and they all are placed one above each other. So now, coming down to what kind of multi-hazard risk assessments are done, or what exactly we should do now that we know that we have the seriousness of multi-hazards happening in cities. So this is taken from a research paper where the title of the paper is Towards a Framework for Systematic Multi-Hazard and Multi-Hazard Risk Multi-Risk Assessment and Management. That this particular research has developed a system where they are evaluating the different hazards and integrating them into a framework. Now, this is what is their research is about. In detail, we can refer this particular paper to understand how the multi-hazard risk assessment framework has been developed. Again, disaster resilience, or multi hazards. So to increase the resilience, we need to address both the hazards, vulnerability, and the recovery. So again, combining these three aspects of all the disasters and creating the resilience curves will help us understand where exactly should be the intervention and what should be the priority in any cities when it comes to multi hazard resilience. So this is again taken from one of the papers. This is the title of that paper: Resilience Assessment Framework for Critical Infrastructure in a Multi-Hazard Environment, Case Study of Transport Assets. Again, the need for multi-hazard risk assessment has been addressed by various papers, new research papers, as well as in news from time to time. This is one of the research paper which is talking about multi disasters in Japan need multiple response in aid. So this can be read, where they have a lot of issues in terms of the floods, in terms of the earthquakes. So they are looking there. They're really more alarmed with the kind of multi disasters which are happening. So now, coming down to multi hazard risk, this we will try to understand what is a multi hazard risk. I have done multi-hazard risk assessment in my PhD, where I had taken four major disasters or hazards which were happening in Dehradun city. So from there, the evaluation was done, and the multi-hazard risk assessment definition has been picked up from there, which refers to a comprehensive evaluation of different types of hazards that are integrated into a system, taking into account not only the characteristics of the single hazardous event but their natural interactions and interrelationships. Now, we can use various methods to integrate the individual risk assessment or integrate the risk assessments into one risk assessment. Now, this was the again risk matrix which can be used, and this was used in my research in the second phase of the research. Now, there are some case studies before I actually discuss about my research. Now, this is an example of California where they have done a multi-hazard risk assessment, where they have taken four disasters: earthquakes, wildfires, and floods. They have also considered the tsunami zones and landslide zones. So they have evaluated and integrated to form a multi-hazard risk map, which is shown here. Okay. Another case study, which is done very recently in 2020, which is a case study of the Shiraz city, China, where they have taken two disasters, which is the flood and the landslide. I think they have also considered the forest fire. Now, this is the matrix through which they have integrated, and what are the factors which were considered for each of them, and how the research was taken up and validation was achieved is all written in there, is all understood in their paper. So we have another case study where a lot of research is done on this cyclone risk assessment for Australia, where they have taken four hazards: landslide, flood, the storm surge, and wind, and each disaster or each hazard is evaluated individually, and then they have been accumulated or collectively integrated into single hazard map, total risk map, which is here. So now, ITC Netherlands is focusing a lot into the multi-hazard risk assessment approaches, and they are taking a lot of courses. And this is the most popular framework of multi-hazard risk assessment, where the methodology which is taught there and which they have understood or developed is understanding the elements of risks and creating the hazard maps to evaluate the risk. So this is the model of multi-hazard risk assessment by ITC Netherlands, which is an institution. So we have another example of Chile, Peru, and Mozambique, where they have taken into consideration around six disasters to create multi-hazard risk assessment map, where their risk modeling consists of hazard, vulnerability, exposure, and these three are combined to identify the risk level assessment of population and assets, and the mitigation strategies are based on these aspects. Again, we have the risk assessment model of Adriatic Sea, where they have taken into consideration the different types of disasters which are not very popularly seen: the oil spill, the SST variation, the abrasion, and other hazard maps, and they have combined it with the help of an equation or a matrix which they have adopted in their research. So there's a lot of work which is done. Again, one case study where they have taken only to assess the multi-hazard risks on heritage assets and not on the entire city. So there were various parameters which were related to the heritage, and only that particular niche of the city was considered for evaluating multi-hazard risk MHR model, where the it was taken up in Illinois city. No, it was taken up in Philippines. I'm sorry, and only heritage aspect of it was considered. Again, New York City model. We have seen New York has very recently gone through the floods which had happened around 2 weeks back, and they have taken into consideration the three disasters: the extreme heat, inland floods, and the coastal floods to create multi-hazard risk model. The model the multi-hazard risk model of each research varies in the method in which they combine, as well as in the factors which they consider in each hazard. So that is all about the multi-hazard risk or research. Coming down to my own research methodology of multi-hazard risk assessment for Dehradun. This particular research was taken up for Dehradun, which is along the foothills of Himalayas, and it has the problem of landslides in its upper part, and it has problem of floods in the lower part of the city. It also has the problem of earthquake. It is in zone 4, and it also has a problem of urban fires, which was later understood as and when the reconnaissance survey or the surveys were taken up. Now, this is the model through which it was evaluated. This was developed through my research, where I'm integrating the four major disasters using the indicator-based systems. Now, these were independent disasters, so these indicators were again independent, and there could be a little repetition of the indicators because these have been evaluated individually and then integrated together into a single multi-hazard risk assessment. So these were the four disasters which were considered for Dehradun city, as well as the urban vulnerability was assessed. So in my research, first of all, risk mapping was done for each type of disaster. So it was understood that when we were considering the urban floods, it is primarily the waterlogging which caused problem in the city because of the poor infrastructure, one, and because of the major part of the city. I mean, this part of the city lying in the flood plains, or it is lying in the flat plains. So the vulnerability aggravated the disaster, or the hazard which was happening because of the slope. The another disaster which was very much problem in Dehradun was urban fires. Now, these fires were seen during summer seasons because the Dehradun city faced a lot of extremes in temperature, and this was one of the major issues which happened. So it was taken into consideration. Again, landslides. The upper part of the city, or almost one third of the city, has the landslide issue because it is located along the foothills of Himalayas. So, and it is also exposed to, or it has a lot of fault lines and the thrust lines which are passing through the city. So, another disaster, the evidences of these disasters were taken into consideration from the past events which happened in city. Then other hazard profile of the city was this is the waterlogging profile. I mean, there is a repetition. So, a visual survey was taken up before actual assessment was done, and the problem was identified ward wise. Each ward were visited. Some aspects were listed, whereas rest of the aspects were told by people as to which probably I was not aware, and they told. And each time a ward was surveyed, those aspects were included in the survey of next ward. So eventually, a list was developed where the vulnerability of all the wards were categorized into some 8 to 9 aspects, and the problem were also listed under each aspect, and a matrix was prepared. Then the entire study area was put up as a base data where thematic maps were created into the GIS format, and indicators data was created. Then the indicators were put to the application of models, and a model each for each disaster or each hazard models were generated, analysis was done, and evaluation was done. Now, this is the case of earthquake, where the matrix by Dr. A.S. Arya was modeled on the housing of the Dehradun city ward-wise, as well as the hazard map was prepared, taking into consideration the liquefaction factor and the earthquake hazard indicators. So this is how the tools and techniques, or what tools and techniques were used for each of the disasters. First of all, for the generalization of the data, normalization of the data was done, raster analysis was done using ArcGIS, which was a major tool for developing the entire research, and AHP was used for doing all the interviews and all. For earthquake, For earthquake risk assessment, damage assessment matrix, and the HAZUS for earthquake scenarios. These two were used to identify the earthquake risk. Then for landslide, it was basically the bivariate statistical method which was used. For flooding, HECRAS model was used and Gumbel's equation was used to identify the return period. HECRAS enabled to identify the extent of floodplain, and rational runoff calculation was used to identify the runoff volume due in within the city. And for urban fire, buffer analysis was done because that is how it was understood that it should be under the firefighting system or not. It was under the firefighting system. Then the various data modeling and data assessment techniques, which are also indicated. Now, integrating the entire multi-hazard risk evaluation, the four disasters used different number of indicators. Like the urban flood used 21 indicators, fire used 23 indicators, landslides used 34 indicators, and earthquake risk assessment included 16 indicators. Now, these indicators, each risk or each type of risk were then combined using the multi hazard risk matrix at the end. So, this is how the multi hazard risk matrix was used to evaluate the high and low hazards. Now, this is urban flood risk index, urban fire risk index, landslide risk index, and earthquake risk index, which were converted at ward level. The entire data was converted at ward level, and then a multi-hazard risk index was calculated. Now, if we see this and if we see this, there are places in maybe in urban fire index which are not vulnerable, which are not in high zone. For example, the one in blue color or high zone might not be the same in urban fire or might not be the same in earthquake. But when we combine them together, the overall priority of each ward with respect to the multi disaster can be seen from this, can be read from this map. Now, how do we read this map? Before that, how the base data was prepared, a lot of digitization was there, where a lot of layers were integrated. This is the HECRAS modeling which was done, where this is the river which is there, and the floodplain analysis is done on this. This is the watershed, which was what a study of watershed of Dehradun, which was done using the HECRAS GeoHMS model. Then identification, how the indicators were integrated. The hazard indicators were identified and the vulnerability indicators were identified separately, and coping capacity was also understood, which was almost nil except in one or two cases. So the risk was evaluated. Now these were the indicators of vulnerability assessment, where for five major subcategories of vulnerability were taken into consideration: the social, economic, the ones which we discussed earlier, more or less the same: infrastructure, services vulnerability index, housing vulnerability index, and the governance indicators or index. So final hazard map which came was again understood at each ward level. So it was understood that maybe the vulnerability of ward number 44 out of the 60 wards could be highest in terms of the multi hazard if taken collectively, but then it might be low in the landslide risk, whereas the ward like ward number 24 might be high in terms of the landslide risk, might not be that high in terms of the overall multi hazard risk assessment. So, this particular analysis or the result was later on considered to prioritize one, the zones at multi hazard level, and in each zone, what should be the priority of, or what strategies should be prioritized in each zone. So, this is how it helped while framing these strategies. So, total areas in high risk of multi hazard were 8, in the medium risk were 24. No, very high, high, medium, and low risk. So, these were the four major categories. The entire recommendations or proposals were for multi hazard risk zones or proposals for risk mitigation strategies and methodological framework model, which was generated out of this research, were the three outputs or the deliverables. Now, this is again urban vulnerability, which was again taken at the ward level. So, again, urban vulnerability, five components. again were put up at each ward level. So each ward level, whether they are in the high risk zone, will tell which strategies should be prioritized for which kind of vulnerability or which type of vulnerability. And these vulnerability maps can be integrated with the hazard maps to identify the prioritization of the areas. So these are my results, which is probably I have discussed. Now, taking into consideration the first ward, which is under the very high risk, the index value of ward number 44 was the highest. The vulnerability, urban flood vulnerability of the urban flood risk component, landslide risk component, and urban fire risk component, earthquake risk. All the four components of four disasters are, again segregated in the same ward, ward number 44, and it has been evaluated at each indicator level. So this again helps us to understand which indicator needs emphasis in terms of the strategization. So I think this is the end of my research, and here I will stop. So do we have questions now?
Thank you, ma'am, for your insightful discussions. Participants,
Yeah.
question, please. You can write your questions in the chat box.
Neha, I would like to add one thing.
Yes.
The tragedy what happened in Kedarnath, similar tragedy we have witnessed in Libya also a few months ago,
Yeah.
when there
Yeah.
was a dam
Yes. Yes.
and the whole city was on that floodplain, that the water channel and whole city, it was badly disrupted. I think there should be some insight in the planning of those cities which are on the waterways. Even if you construct the dam on the upper side of the river, you are not safe. There
Actually,
could be the chances of
dam which caused major damage. If dam had not collapsed, the disaster will not be to that extent. So it is basically human error which has accentuated the triggered the multiple disaster phenomena. So that is there.
There is one question, ma'am, that
Yes.
how disaster management can be helpful in development control, regulation, or master planning.
Yes, I have already indicated slide where urban risk management or the development of any city, or if we do, and the disaster management, how they can be integrated at at the assessment level. See, when you are doing